Alrighty, welcome everybody. We're going to be getting into some literature this semester, and I'd like to frame it under the umbrella of tragedy. This is a lecture on the Aristotelian definition of tragedy. Here we go. You can find this lecture on my class YouTube page, and you can also find the slides in Schoology in the Course Essentials folder for tragedy. So here we go. Aristotle, let's go way back, was a Greek philosopher. He lived in the 4th century BCE. He wrote a book called Poetics, which is the earliest surviving text on dramatic or literary theory, in which he discusses the criteria or the standards for theater. Of course, at this time, theater was a primary form of entertainment. Aristotle once said that a man doesn't become a hero until he can see the root of his downfall. What does that mean? I'll ask you to ponder that. So, a tragic hero is a literary character who makes a judgment error that inevitably leads to his own downfall or destruction. And some classic Greek mythological tragic heroes are people like Sisyphus, Icarus, and Prometheus. Here is Sisyphus, here is Icarus, and here is Prometheus. Sisyphus was condemned to eternally pushing a boulder to the top of a hill, and upon reaching the top, the boulder would roll back down, and Sisyphus would have to retrieve it, and day in and day out, push that boulder back up the hill. There's a great essay by the famed French philosopher by the name of Albert Camus, and he wrote an essay about how Sisyphus' struggle is our struggle. Here's Icarus, who had wax wings. He was told not to fly so high, too close to the sun. Of course, he pushed his limits, his wings melted, and he fell to the earth. And here is Prometheus getting his liver pecked out day in and day out for sharing the secrets of how to make fire with human beings. The gods forbade him from doing that. So there are 5 core elements of tragedy, and these are Greek terms: Hamartia, Peripeteia, Anagnorisis, Hubris, and Catastrophe. Those last 2 might sound familiar. So a true tragedy must have these 5 elements. So let's talk about what they mean. Hamartia is a flaw or error in judgment. So the character has to have a weakness or some kind of a tragic flaw that eventually leads to their downfall. Sometimes this tragic flaw, this characteristic, is in normal circumstances a good thing. Maybe it's like ambition or passion, things like that, but that turn on them in the circumstance of the story. So they become doomed as a result of that characteristic. Let's go here. Peripeteia. The character experiences a reversal in fortune. So that's why we have this little recycling sign here. It means that things are going great and then suddenly they change. And this is brought about by the hero's own error in judgment. The hero here is faced with a very serious decision that they have to make. They make that decision and suddenly things start to go wrong. Anagnorisis. This is the discovery or recognition that the reversal of fortune was brought about by their own actions. They realize, I shouldn't have done that. And so they, of course, try to correct that mistake. And the character thereby gains insight into their life as a result. They become aware of themselves. And therefore, they must have some degree of intelligence because that means they're reflective individuals. Hubris. The character must have excessive pride. Hubris is a word that we still use fairly commonly to describe someone who's a little bit overconfident, a little too prideful. And it's this pride which often leads the character further toward their doom. Catastrophe. This is the hero's fate What this means is basically there is a fate that the hero experiences which is greater than deserved. What does that mean? It means that they made a mistake, but the results of that mistake are horrible, and it doesn't equate. And so they're struggling to rectify that wrongdoing. So in other words, I love this quote here, the hero must face uncommon suffering, but confront that suffering with uncommon dignity. So the uncommon suffering part is that they didn't deserve something. They're suffering more than they deserved. But the great thing about tragic heroes is they confront that suffering. They deal with that suffering with a great amount of dignity. They do not let that suffering vanquish them, destroy them, etc. In fact, it's an opportunity for them to grow. And that's really important when it comes to the tragic heroes, that we see an evolution of their character. Catharsis. So in Aristotle's time, the hero must be nobility. So we're talking about like kings, aristocracy, things like that. The hero must not be so perfect, though, that we can't relate to them. If they're too perfect, too high above us, we're not going to have the same emotions that we would have for someone that we can relate to on a kind of a more personal level. So we have to have a degree of sympathy for the hero. And as a result, we experience what's called a purging of emotions. So catharsis, the long and short of it, is a purging of emotion. We're feeling something. We have emotions that occur while we watch the hero's life play out. So I'm going to ask you to think about, why might catharsis be important? Why do we want to go to a theater or a movie or sit on our couch and watch Netflix and experience a purging of emotion, a release of emotion? Why would an audience wish to view the downfall of the tragic hero and view their struggle? So reasons for tragedy: to experience the lessons of the tragic hero without having to necessarily go through those experiences ourselves. I mean, you could think about some of the tragic stories you have seen and how you definitely would not want to be in the shoes of that character, but we get to watch it play out. We get to learn, number 2 here, from the mistakes of the tragic hero. We can also gain a greater appreciation for one's own life, for our life, our lived existence. As we're watching the tragic hero's life played out, we get to say, we're not them, but we can learn from that experience and have a greater appreciation for the world that we live in. So there's a few reasons, and I'm sure there's many more. So in summary, eventually the Aristotelian tragic hero dies a tragic death, having fallen from great heights and having made an irreversible mistake. And most importantly, the hero courageously accepts their death with honor. So this is the Aristotelian definition of tragedy. There are Shakespearean definitions, and there's more modern definitions, which we'll also be looking at, that change things up a little bit. Maybe, for example, more modern heroes don't necessarily die, but just experience a great downfall, the loss of all of their wealth or their friends or their pride or their whatever it might be, not necessarily their lives. So hopefully that gives you some perspective of how to approach thinking about the films and the literature that we'll be viewing and reading over the course of the next several weeks. If you have questions, let me know. Again, you can find this video on YouTube on Mr. Iser's class YouTube page. And you can also find the slides in the Course Essentials folder. Thanks for listening.